Today's daf yomi is Menachos daf Chaf Aleph, Menachos 21, and we're going to start on Chaf Aleph Amud Aleph at the word Gufa, which is around 12 or 13 lines down from the top. So we got a little farther yesterday, but we'll start back a little bit to just to go over that part. Gufa Amar Ziri Amar Ravi Chanina. So we're discussing blood. Remember we discussed blood, whether that blood does not need to be salted, and one of the reasons is because blood that's cooked is no longer able to be brought as a carbon, and so therefore salting is like cooking. Anyway, so the Gemara says the statement of Zeiri, Amar Chanina, Dam Shevishu, blood that's cooked, Eino Verolav. You're not going to be in violation of the penalty of kares, of eating blood, because once it's cooked, it cannot be brought as a carbon, and so therefore you're not going to be in violation of eating it. So it's not kosher, but you're not liable for kares. Because Rashi says the Torah only prohibits us only blood that is capable of achieving atonement. And since this blood cannot achieve atonement because it can't be brought as a carbon, you're not in violation of kares. And by the way, I should say, it's definitely not kosher. This is only the Zeiri's opinion. And it's not clear if that's the way we rule. But even if we would rule like Zeiri, it still wouldn't be kosher. It just wouldn't be kares. So Yosef Rava So Rava repeated this teaching of Zeiri. So Abaye challenges him from the following teaching. Hikpa Esadam va'achlu says in the Brisa. It says in the Brisa. Let's say the blood congealed and then you ate it, or if the fat became melted and you swallowed it, chayev, you're liable. So we see from here that even though it was congealed, obviously through cooking, that nevertheless you're going to say you're liable. So the Gemara says, "Lo kasha, kan shehikba ba'or, kan shehikba b'chama." It depends how it was cooked. If it was cooked up in the sun or in the heat or in the fire. If it was cooked up in the sun, or lo hadar, then if it was cooked up in the fire, it can never go back to its original state, and therefore you're not liable. But b'chama, but if it's cooked up in the sun, hadar. Then once it cools down, it'll go back to its original state, and so therefore you're going to be liable. So the Gemara says, but really, b'chama nami, even if it was cooked up, heated up in the sun, why would you say you're liable? Why don't we say that since it once became pushed away from being able to be brought as a carbon, it's no longer ever eligible again to being brought as a carbon. Once you're disqualified at one point, you're always disqualified. Once Rav Mani asked Rabbi Yochanan the following question: Dam shekiresh, let's say you have blood that congealed, va'achlu, and then they ate it. What will be the law? And Rabbi Yochanan said, since it became pushed off at one point, it's always pushed off, and therefore you're not liable. Ishtik. So so he was quiet at that point. So Rava was quiet. He didn't have an answer. So then the Gemara says that Amarle. So at that point, Abai says to Rava, Dilma, maybe what's going on here is maybe the source where it says that you're liable by the blood that congealed, that's talking about the blood on the outer altar, and the blood that says that you're exempt if it congeals is bechatas apnimius. And so it's talking about two different types of blood. The blood that's brought on the outer altar, that you're going to be liable if it congeals, because you could still because it still could be brought, and also non-sacred blood, if it congeals, you're liable, since it could still be brought as a kapara on the outer altar. Whereas where you're going to be exempt is on the inner altar blood, because that cannot be brought. You had a question, Bill? So the Gemara says, Amar. So when Rava heard this, he said to Abaye, Ad Karan Milsa, you remind me of something to Amar Rav Chisda. And Rav Chisda taught, Dam shekarish bechatos v'achlan v'achlu chayev, that there's blood that congealed by the sin offerings and you ate it, you're liable. Why? V'lokach v'nasan Amar Achmana, Because by the outer altar, you just have to take it and apply it. And even though it's congealed, you could take it and apply it. Yes. The sin offering is to achieve atonement if you did an accidental sin, which if you had done intentionally, you'd be liable for currents. So that's the purpose of the sin. Let's say you eat the non-kosher fat, or that's an example. If you did it intentionally, be liable for currents. If you do it accidentally, you have to bring a sin offering. Well, you would have an atonement. Spiritually, you would come closer to Hashem. So now the very good questions. So the Gemara says, so by the achatos chitzonios, you achieve a tone. You're still going to be liable because by the outer altar it says to take and to apply, and so therefore you're going to be liable because you could still do that even though it's congealed. The achatos apanimios va'achlo pater. But if it was congealed by the inner ones, you're exempt. Why? V'taval v'hiza. It fit. Because it says there that you have to dip your finger and then sprinkle it. But once it's congealed, you can't dip your finger and sprinkle it. Yes? Yes, we have to do it. We do it on Yom Kippur. We do it by the Par Kohen HaMashiach and Par Olam Davar Shal Tzibor. That's why we do it. Yes. So we did that earlier in Zevachim. The different ways in which it's sprinkled. It goes into the exact details, but we're not going to go into that now because I don't remember it 100% precisely. But it's Gemara and Zevachim that goes into the way it's sprinkled exactly. The Rava Didei, Rava himself said, "Afilu b'chatos apinimios va'achlu chayev." That even if it was the blood of the inner altar, it congealed and you ate it, you'll be liable. Why? All the kenegdo roi b'chatos achitzonu, since that congealed blood will be appropriate by the outer sin offering, and therefore you're liable. Amar Rav Papa Hilkach, so therefore Rav Papa added dam chamor shakirish. Let's say you have the blood of a donkey that congealed va'alcho and you ate it, chayav, you're liable. Why? Because opposite is going to be appropriate to be brought by the chatos. Similarly, it could be brought by the outer chatos. So therefore, by the donkey's blood, you'd be liable, even though it congealed. Amar Rav Gidel Amar Ziri. So then Rav Gidel said the name of Ziri, dam, if it's blood, ben lach ben yavesh, whether the blood is liquidy or if it's dry, it's chotzetz. It serves as an interposition. What does that mean? When you go into the mikvah, you can't have anything on your body, and you can't have what's called a chatzitza, something so you can't have anything that interposes you between you and the water. So the blood, whether it's liquid or dry, will be an interposition. You had a question? That's how you become purified. That makes you closer to Hashem. So the Gemara says, Meisvei, yeah, for sure. So the Gemara challenges this teaching that Iri taught, the blood, the ink, the honey, the milk, when they're dry, they serve as a chatzitza, but not when they're liquidy. So the Gemara says, lo kasha, it depends if it's sticking to you. It could be liquidy and still sticking. It's beginning to dry, then it'll be a problem. But if it's not sticking, then it's not a chatzitza. Yes. So some men go every day. Some men only go on the eve of a holiday or Erev Shabbos or on the eve of Yom Kippur. So different customs. You're supposed to shower before and after. So now the Gemara continues. It said in the pasuk, Kol karban minchas chava melch timlach. So we had expounded this verse yesterday to learn many different things. So now the Gemara says, what is the last melach in the verse? We didn't get up to that. Timlach. What does that mean? Actually, the beginning, Kol Karban Minchas Chava Melch Timlach. The second, after it says Melach, it says Timlach. What is that coming to teach us? Gemara says, look at the Tanya. It's coming to teach us Melach with salt. Yachol Tivonehu. I might think Tivonehu. We'll see what that means. Tamom or Timlach? No, it's salt. Timlach. I might think Yachol B'mei Melach. I might think you could even salt the carbon with mei melach, which is like salt water. Tamalomar b'melach. And then it says in the verse, it has to be actual salt. It says, velo tashbis. The verse continues, they cannot never stop. Lo tashbis melach. Have a melach she'ena shoveses. Bring salt that will not be shoveses. That will never stop. That'll always be around in the summer and in the winter. What type of salt is that? Azo. That's zo melach sedomis. This is the thin salt that is called Sodom salt or Sodom salt. That the sea casts onto the dry land. Uminayin shim lo matzah melch sedomis shemevi melch istrokenis. How do I know if you don't find melch sedomis? You could bring the melch istrokenis, which is a coarser salt that you dig up from the ground. Tamalomar takriv kolshu, anything, any salt. Takriv mikol makom. Takriv vafilu b'Shabbos. Takriv vafilu b'tumah. You put the salt on the altar, on the offering, even on Shabbos, and even if it's being brought in a state of communal tumah. My tivonea. So we go back to this verse. Melach, it said, it says in the verse, "B'melach yachol tivoneo." Tamalomer timlach. What does the word tivoneo mean? Amarav barula achid kamar. Yachol yitbonenenu. I might think you should put a lot of milk, a lot of salt on. Kitav and betit, like when if you're mixing straw with mud, yeah, you put that it's make like a big mud. So we don't do that, just salt. Amalei Abaye, Abaye says, no, that's not the right word. By the way, it would say yitboneneu. Yitbonenenu, not yitbonenehu. So if that's the case, not tivoneu, it would say yitbonenenu. So Elam Abaye Yachol Yasenu Kabinyan. I might think you have to pile up the salt like a building. Amalei Rabbi Yachol Yivnenu mi by the way. We should say Yivnenu, not tivoneu. Elam Rava Yachol Tivoneu. I might think Tivoneu, my Tivoneu. And Ravashi Yachol Yitembo Tam Kabina. I might think that you should put a lot of salt. I might think that you should put a lot of salt so that the salt will give taste in a person, like understanding. Tamom or Timwach. You don't need to put that much salt, just a little bit of salt. How does he do it? Maybe Aver, he brings the limb. No sinal of melach. He puts salt on the limb. And then he flips it over. No sinal of melach. And he puts salt on the other side. And he puts it on the altar. So too, if somebody wants to cook meat in the pot, you need to salt it first in order to get out the blood. You don't need to salt it more than that. You just pour salt on one side and then salt it on the other side. And Tana Rabbanan, melach shal gabe ha'ever, the salt that's on the limb of a carbon, mo'alinbo. If you benefit from it, then you're misappropriating temple property, mi'ila. But shal gabe ha'kevesh, but if salt fell off the limb and onto the ramp of the altar, or shebarosha shel mizbech, or the salt that's on the top of the altar, when you were salting the mincha, ein mo'alinbo. There's no mi'ila. The Amar Ramatna Maikra. What's the verse that teaches us that? V'kraftem v'nei Hashem v'shlichu ha'kohanim aleim melech ve'alu osam olola Hashem. It says ve'alu osam olola, so it means to say that the limb with the salt, both of them are called an olah, and so therefore both of them have the law of me'ilah. We learned in the Mishnah that the court instituted several things with respect to the karbanos, and one of the takonos was that the kohanim. This is the Mishnah in Shkolim, that the kohanim are allowed to benefit from the holy salt. Gemara says, Tanan awesome. We went to the Mishnah in Shkolim, ala melech v'alaitzim, shiva kohanim neusimen. The court made a takon about salt and wood, that the kohanim can benefit from the sacred salt, from the salt of the temple. So what did we learn about this salt? Amar Shmuel, shanu ela l'karbanam. That's only for their carbon, when they have to salt their carbon, the mincha. But not they can't use the salt of the temple just to salt up their soup or their food. That they can't do. I have first the Gemara's assumption is, what does it mean you can't use this, that you can use the salt for their carbon? That means to say the carbonos that they bring, and to eat, that's to eat their kachim food. That's not allowed. But it can't be. We know that they're allowed to salt their skins of kachim, which the kohanim get, which are actually chulin, which are not sacred. So lachilas kachim lo yavinu. So why aren't they allowed to use it for the food that's sacred that they're eating? The Tanya, how do we know that they could use it for their skin? Nimtzas atomer shlosha mekomos hamelach nesuna. The salt is placed in 3 places in the temple. Belishkas hamelach, in the chamber of salt, valgabi hakevesh, on top of the altar, on top of the ram, Barosh Hashem on top of the altar. What would happen is there in this chamber of salt, that's where they would salt their skins. Agabe akevesh, shesham mochem asayvarm. There they would on the ramp they would salt the limbs. In Barosh Hashem shesham mochem hakomets. There they would salt the komets, the lavona vaktoras, minchas kohanim, minchas kohan mashiach, minchas nesachim, the oath. So it's clear from the brayso that the kohanim are allowed to salt the skin of the kachim with the sacred salt. So how could you say that they can salt their skins, but the kachim itself is prohibited to use the salt? Elamayla karbanam. What does it mean when they can use the salt for their carbon? Lachilas karbanam, and they can use their sacred salt when they eat their carbon. They can put salt on their breast and the thigh of the shlamim that they eat, or the meat of the chatos and the hashamos. So my lachil, what does it mean when we say for achila that they cannot do it? It's achila de chulim. That's 1 second. We'll come back to you in a minute. That's the achila of regular food. That's not sacred. They're not allowed to use the sacred salt. Gemara says chulim pshita my boasam. Of course they can use it for chulin. What's the chulin even doing there? You're not allowed to bring the chulin into the courtyard of the temple. So Gemara says afagav. So Gemara says you might have thought afagav damar mar. Yochlu, sheyochlu imachunu truma. I might think that with respect to the shirayim, that it says that you're allowed to eat it with chulin and truma. I might think that since you're allowed to eat the mincha with chulin and truma, so that you're going to have a good meal with it. Still, you can't put the salt of the kachim. It's logical to assume that these karbanam, if you might have thought what is the carbon that they're going to do it for, to salt their carbon, that they're allowed to do it the time of the asni bezdin, that the only reason why it's allowed is because the court made a stipulation. Hello, asni bezdin lo, but if the court didn't make this stipulation, it wouldn't be allowed. Hashali Israel yavinan. But the regular Israelites are allowed to salt the kodshim with their sacrifices. For sure, the Kohanim can. And how do we know the regular Israelites can do that? The Tanya Yachol Omer Arei Mincha Yavi Melach Mitoch Peso Kederach Shemevi Levona Mitech Peso. I might think if you say I have to bring carbon mincha, that you also have to bring the salt, just like you have to bring the levona. V'dinu nemar avi mincha ve'avi melach v'nemar avi mincha ve'avi levona malavona mitoch pesach melach mitoch pesach. I think just like you have to bring the levona, you also have to bring the salt. Or maybe it's just the opposite. Nemar avi mincha ve'avi melach v'nemar avi mincha ve'avi eitzim. Or maybe just like the wood is the communal wood, and you don't have to bring your own wood, so to the salt. Which is the salt similar to? Is it more similar to the levona, or is it more similar to the wood? The wood is applicable by all offerings, unlike the levona. And don't prove it from the levona, which doesn't apply by all offerings. Or maybe just the opposite. Or maybe or in the levona, it's more similar to, because the levona doesn't come in one utensil. Levona comes in one utensil, unlike the wood. So what's the source that you don't have to bring the salt? It says bris melech olam he. It says you always need the salt on the offerings. Ulalan, it says omer me'es b'nei Yisrael bris olam. Mal mishal tzibor avkam mishal tzibor. Just like with respect to the second verse, which refers to the lechem upon him, the bread on the table, it's communal. So to the salt, it's communal. So when you bring your mincha, you have to bring the flour, the levona, but you don't have to bring the salt and the wood. Gemara says that's not a proof. Didn't Rav Shisha B'rei Ravidi said, "Well, nitzchacha ela ben buchri." That verse, the stipulation that the Kohanim are allowed to salt their carbon was needed for the position of Ben Bukhri, who says that the Kohanim don't have to give a half shekel for the carbon seaboard. The Tanan, Amar Rabbi Yehuda, hey ben Bukhri b'yadne, kol kohen sheshokel, any kohen that gives a half shekel for the communal offering Eino Chote is not sinning. Meaning to say, that means that if he brought a half shekel, he's not a sinning. That if he didn't bring it, that ideally, that lechatchila is not obligated to bring it. Amar Rabbi Yochanan Zakkai, lo, that doesn't make sense. Ella kol kohen she'eno shokel chote, ella shekohanim dorshim mikra zela atzman. He says any kohen that doesn't give a half shekel is going to be sinning, because the Kohanim were saying that they're exempt because they expounded a verse. What was the verse that they expounded? They don't need to give it. It says, "Kol minchas kohen kalil tiyelo techel." The Kohen's offering is burnt; it's not eaten. Oh, the omer shelechem lechem upon him shelanu he. So the Kohanim say, since the offering of the omer and the 2 loaves and the loaves of bread on Shavuos, they came from the communal money, and yet the Kohanim could eat it, and also shalanui. How are we allowed to eat them? And so it's clearly the case we're exempt from giving the money, but nevertheless the Kohanim were making a mistake, because that verse is talking about just the mincha that the Kohen brought by himself, but the communal offerings do have a din of mincha Yisrael. Well, Ben Bukhri according to Ben Bukhri, who says that initially speaking, they're not obligated even if they bring it, they're a sinner. Why? Because since he's exempt from bringing it, if he brings it, he's in effect bringing chulin into the altar. So the Gemara says, no, it's not the case. Even though they're exempt, the ma'isi umasar lahon tzibor, that he brings the money and gives it over to the community. But anyway, the Gemara says, okay, you know what? We'll stop here. We'll pick this up tonight, and tomorrow morning we'll stop here. This is the daf. We'll stop here. Baruch Hashem. We'll pick it up tomorrow. But we'll take your questions. Sure, of course.